Hi, I'm Tara. Welcome to Les Do Books. You can email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with any questions or comments, or come join our Facebook group, the Lesbian Review Book Club. I'm excited because I'm joined today by Heather Rose Jones, author of the Alpenia series, which is out everywhere from Bella Books. She's also the host of the Lesbian Historic Motif Project, which you can also catch on the Lesbian Talk Show, and you should because it's fabulous. So welcome, Heather.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, you have a theme that you want to talk about. Can you share what that's about?
Well, I have always loved historical fiction. Ever since I was a kid. It started when I was around 10 years old and had a chance to spend a year in Europe. And historical fiction has been the way that I learned big picture history. So whether it was romantic or not, that's always been a major part of my reading. And I only really discovered Regency romance via the famous Georgette Heyer when I was in my 30s, and I was staying at a friend's house, and she had like a whole shelf full of Heyer, and I almost didn't talk to her for the rest of the time I was visiting there. And anyone who has read my Alpenia series can see the underlayer of Regency romance, especially in the first book. Back when I was first starting the story, the book These Old Shades was a major contributing theme to the sort of nexus of ideas that inspired it. And I've always wanted to try to find more lesbian regencies because, two great tastes that go together. So when I recently read The Covert Captain, which I'll be talking about, it occurred to me I thought I had enough examples of good lesbian regencies to put together for, a little show. And thinking about it, there's a resistance in the lesbian reading community to historical fiction, and especially to genres like Regencies where they're so strongly associated with a lot of very popular heterosexual tropes. And you think, oh, well, how can you do lesbian stories when you don't have any dukes or something like that? And I wanted to put together a framework, an argument for saying, here is why the English Regency is actually the perfect setting for romances between women. And then use that as a context for talking about the books.
I love this. I am so excited about this. I also grew up swiping Regency romances off my mom's shelf. And then when I came back to reading romance, before I found lesfic, so probably about 10 years ago, it was that period when Regency romances were kind of exploding again, but they were kind of on the steamier side.
Uh-huh.
And there were some really excellent, I really enjoyed what Courtney Milan was doing and Tessa Dare and some of those authors that they're still very popular right now. But when I came to lesbian fiction, I noticed exactly what you said, there's so little. And when I would find it, I would get kind of excited, but I think it's fewer books than I could count on one hand.
Yeah, and with any kind of historicals, there's this vicious cycle where people think they're not going to like them, and so the books aren't very popular. And what that means is that the writers who might be writing them don't have the incentive, or they don't have the incentive to really build the skill set, the knowledge and the skill set. Because historical fiction is tricky. You can't just read a few books and then write one. And I think that getting really great lesbian historical fiction requires having that community of readers who will support it and give the authors a chance to grow and develop. So I'm all for cheerleading, starter places for the historicals.
Mm-hmm. So you have an argument, you say. Can you tell us more?
Well, so I came up with 5 features of Regency England that contribute to making it a good setting for romance between women. And I use that phrase because lesbian isn't necessarily the word they would have used for themselves. And you will see what I mean by that in this first example. So the first point is romantic friendship. Romantic friendship was a concept that existed actually starting as late as as early as the later 17th century, but really coming to the fore in the 18th century, very strong in the 19th century. And the idea is that women's emotional relationships would primarily be with other women, and this was a good and noble thing. It was an expected thing. It wasn't incompatible with being married to men, and this is where I think a lot of lesbian readers kind of balk at the idea. But what romantic friendship as a concept created was an atmosphere where women had these strong public emotional relationships with each other. They would use the language of romance to talk to each other. They would express, physical affection to each other in public. It was a normal part of society that good friends, when they visited each other, would sleep in the same bed and hug and kiss before they went to sleep. So what this creates is a context where if these women were also having an erotic relationship, or if they were having a romantic relationship that was marriage-like without necessarily being sexual, it would be completely within the normal context of how women were expected to act. And you can see this with a number of prominent women. One of the earliest examples that people mention is Queen Anne of England in around the turn of the 17th century, the end of the 17th century, who had a romantic friendship with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, and they were famous for doting on each other and expressing love to each other. And nobody thought it was sexual, and nobody thought there was anything unusual about it. And they're just, one example of a very public friendship. You get, I'll get into some other famous romantic friendships of the Regency era in one of my other points. But the idea is that the whole concept of romantic friendship was a blind, a smokescreen, and yet not in a false sense. It created a context where the idea of romantic love between women was utterly normal and utterly expected and taken for granted by the entire society. So, within that context, my first book that takes strong advantage of this is a classic. If you ask readers to name one lesbian Regency romance, they will generally come up with Pembroke Park by Michelle Martin. This was published by Naiad Press back in 1986, and it is unfortunately completely out of print. You can track down secondhand copies on Amazon if you're lucky. And it would be a wonderful thing if some publisher could track down the author and get it back into print, because it's a classic. It's very well written, and it's a little formulaic, which Regency romance always is. The basic plot is that the widowed Lady Joanna Sinclair is irresistibly drawn to the somewhat mannish Lady Diana March, who is the leader of a rather eccentric social set that includes Joanna's brother-in-law and his very good friend Geoffrey, who we learn are, in fact, also in a romantic relationship. They are expected to recognize that they're lovers. And a full... You eventually come to realize there's this full social network of people with non-default sexuality, shall we say. So Joanna's growing friendship with Diana, who is known to be an eccentric, puts her at odds with her overbearing brother Hugo, who wants her to get married again and is not above using the custody of Joanna's daughter as a bargaining chip in this pressure. And then the rest of the story is how they strategize short-circuiting Hugo's plans and, of course, the developing romance between Joanna and Diana and how they come to live happily ever after. So it's a classic, if somewhat formulaic Regency story, and brings in, nice subplots to throw barriers in the way of the relationship. But it comes out of this context of nobody thinks the idea of Joanna and Diana moving in together and spending the rest of their lives together is odd or outrageous. They just think that, getting married again would obviously be the better choice. And so it's a great example of how romantic friendship provides a context for setting up the relationship without having the whole story be about being transgressive. My second point, and this is something that happens periodically within history, is that the Regency era in England had a massive gender imbalance. And this was because of the Napoleonic Wars. And just sort of getting ahead of myself, in America at the end of the 19th century, the Civil Wars created a similar gender imbalance that again correlated with a period when women's romantic friendships and Boston marriages and that sort of thing were an ordinary part of society. If you've got a surplus of women, as they said, then it becomes normal for women to find other living arrangements besides being married to men. So the Napoleonic Wars were a major defining feature of the Regency era and typically show up in Regency romance in some feature. There were significant casualties among the British military, though nowhere near as serious as they were in France. And if you look at the British population from the 1801 census, which was the first census conducted in the UK, you take that as a starting point, maybe as much as 5% of the male population died in the war in the next decade. Or at least there is a drop-off of 5% of the population, which it is reasonable to attribute to the war. So also taking into account that, of course, the recruiting age for the military is pretty much the same as your standard, marriage age for men, you end up with a lot of women who, as we see in Jane Austen's novels, don't have any expectation of marriage. That there are too many women and not enough men, and very often not enough men of sufficient economic standing to be good marriage partners. And you looked around at the opportunities and you said, well, I'm going to be an old maid. That's it. I need to find something else to do with my life. And in this context, women found a lot of different ways to approach it. Usually you would end up living in the household of some other family member, and you would contribute to the domestic economy in your own way. You might be an unpaid governess or a housekeeper equivalent. But another thing that was an option was to become a companion to some better off woman who didn't have immediate family and wanted, someone to live with her, someone to socialize with, because women did not typically go around socializing solo. And again, this presents a context where two not immediately related women of similar social standing are sharing a household and having, very often very affectionate relationships, and nobody thought anything of it. This was normal. It was just part of the landscape. So as the book I wanted to bring in as an example of this, we have Frederica and the Viscountess by Barbara Davies, which is published by Bedazzled Ink. And this is a more of an Austen-esque story. You can, in fact, see the pieces of material that she has carefully snipped out of Jane Austen's novels and sewn together to form her plot. Frederika Bartram is at that delicate edge of spinsterhood where she has to seriously contemplate that if she refuses the marriage proposal that she is anticipating, or perhaps dreading, from the tedious Mr. Dunster, she will never have another opportunity to leave her parents' roof. Her sister Amelia is young enough that she's still dreaming of romantic adventure. And into their quiet country neighborhood comes their neighbor's scandalous sister, another Joanna, Viscountess Norland. Her scandal goes beyond having abandoned her husband and infant to go gallivanting around the continent, but it also encompasses a taste for wearing trousers, which, by the way, that kind of overt cross-dressing shows up a lot in lesbian regencies. It's a little bit harder to justify historically, but never mind that. So she sometimes goes around wearing trousers. She is rumored to have fought a duel with pistols to the death. And she attracts visitors to the neighborhood like the libertine Lord Peregrine, who finds it amusing to turn the head of young Amelia Bertram to no good end. So you have a plot where you have the younger sister who has a romantic entanglement, and that provides a context for the characters to go on adventures together. And how this fits into the theme of gender imbalance is that, again, Frederika is not expecting to have marriage options. She's looking at the best of a bad deal, And there simply are not other alternatives. She's not averse to marriage as a concept, but she'd rather be single than take a bad marriage. And being single in her parents' house means that, you're never really an adult in that sense. So when she meets Joanna and she is, intrigued by this very fascinating neighbor, and they begin an attraction, which then, blooms into love in the course of their adventures. And in fact, there is a discussion towards the end of it where they're saying, it's like, well, what will people think? What will people say? And Joanna's lady's maid says, well, just have her move in as your companion and nobody will think anything of it. Which, that's one of those things where the reader needs to be told that this is a normal thing in context in the society. You wouldn't have needed your lady's maid to tell you that that was one option. So it shows how you can put together a female household that is considered, normal, socially acceptable. You're not cutting yourself off from your family. This is just one of the ways of living.
I love it. I hadn't even heard of that book, and I feel like I need to immediately go out and buy it. So what is your third argument?
So the third one, and now we're getting into some of the issues where it's not simply you need to know this about history, but you need to unknow this about modern experience. My number 3 reason is no Freudian psychology. Keep in mind that Freud comes from the era around, the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the things that can be hardest for writers of historical romance to capture is how very different the attitudes of people in history were towards sex, love, and marriage. Our modern medicalized view of sexual orientation, where it's, it's like, oh, well, this is just, the way you are psychologically, you're born this way, blah, blah, blah. That didn't exist before the late 19th century. That was invented by a bunch of proto-psychologists, mostly in Germany, who decided to invent a psychological pathology called, inversion. And earlier than that, people had a lot of different attitudes towards, same-sex love. And they had very different attitudes depending on whether it was men or women. But they didn't have this concept that most of us grew up with that, oh, this is a psychological, condition. I don't want to say illness because we've mostly gotten past that. But the whole psychological context of homosexuality that was pervasive through the 20th century did not exist in the early 19th century. And one of the things that is specific to England to some extent is that although male homosexuality was in fact illegal, and, this created a great deal of hardship and tragedy, but female homosexuality was invisible to the law. There were no laws against it. There's this probably mythical quote from Queen Victoria when she was asked about it, and she said something like that, but English women wouldn't do that. Which, of course, isn't true, but it meant that there was no context for understanding female homosexuality as illegal or officially prohibited. You might deny that it was done, except among the lower classes, perhaps, or, foreigners.
Sure.
But there wasn't a context where if you found yourself attracted to another woman, you would say, oh my God, I'm sick, I'm wrong, I'm evil. Those ideas didn't exist for it. There were pressures around, if a romance between two women was so strong that one of them, say, refused an offer of marriage, people would think that was very odd. But they wouldn't think it was deranged, let's say. Mm-hmm. So, and one of the things that contributes to this, and again, this is sometimes hard for modern writers and readers to work their heads around as a good thing, is that people had definitions of sex that very often excluded the types of activity that women enjoyed. So you could say, well, no, we aren't having sex because there's no man involved. And while today we think of that as erasure and saying, well, there doesn't have to be a man involved for it to be sex. But in the historic context, that kind of definition meant that there was a lot of scope for women having, physical relationships with each other, and for them not even to put it in the same context as fornication or something like that. So because the social prohibitions focused on sex as it was defined at the time, rather than love and affection, you can write women in Regency settings enjoying their romances in public view without any fear of condemnation, and to be enjoying erotic activities in private without them getting all tangled up in knots about what they're doing. So the book I wanted to use to illustrate this is a really fabulous recent book called Spring Flowering by Farah Mendlesohn, and it's published by Manifold Press. And Farah is a historian. This is, in fact, her first novel, and it came out of, like so many of us, she says, like, I want to read a lesbian romance, Regency romance, and there aren't any that really, hit my sweet spot, so I'll just have to write one. She's very deeply involved in history, and she's currently working on a study of historical fiction set in the English Civil War that is aimed at the young adult market.
Okay.
So that's kind of depth she gets into. And she wanted to look at not merely a very strongly historically rooted story, but one that focused on middle-class families. She being of a working class background herself. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. She doesn't have a lot of patience for everything being dukes and earls. So her main character comes from a family that's involved in manufacturing in Birmingham. And the basic storyline goes like this. It's once again about a woman who's facing a choice between a conventional marriage or exploring other possible life patterns. Her father was a religious curate, and he dies, and she goes to live with her cousins in Birmingham, where there is sort of a family business manufacturing basically small metal objects for the clothing trade, buttons and buckles and things like that. And the daughters of that family have the option of being sort of marginally involved in the business, but again, they're mosely, looking at marriage as their option, and marriage to somebody that their family knows personally. So this restricts the options a lot. And if there's no candidates that are really appealing within that small scope, then your other options tend to fall outside of marriage. So Anne Gray, the main character, is sort of emotionally adrift, not only because of her father's death, but because she had a very special close friend, Jane, that she had a emotional and physical relationship with since they were adolescents. And Jane has just gotten married. And both of them understood that, this is a thing that happens. And after marriage, then, the relationship is different, even though they'll still be friends. But it leaves Anne in a place where, she isn't really anchored. She's looking around, and she gets an offer of marriage from the new curate who takes her father's place. And, this would be like a chance to essentially go back home. But she doesn't really feel about him the way she feels you ought to about somebody you would be marrying. And she meets, the description is the deliciously unsettling widow, Mrs. King, who is a business partner of her uncle and is looking for a in-house governess or teacher for her two young sons, and who has had very close relationships with other female companions in the past. And so she offers Anne the option of moving in to her household and becoming, a live-in companion and governess, and with the option of a physical relationship as well. And that is not the end of the story, but the rest of it would kind of, spoil some of the twists. So I'll leave it there. And this fits into the theme of, that erotic relationships between women were not problematic for the people involved in them, in that the relationship that Anne and Jane had is portrayed as very, very normal and natural. I mean, it's not that they were like, groping each other in public, because you didn't do that. I mean, nobody did that. That was just not how well-behaved people behaved. But they don't think anything strange about, having a relationship that includes, passionate kisses and fondling each other in private. And so there's none of this sense of, he's like, oh my God, what is the strange thing I'm feeling? How has anybody else ever felt like this? I must be the only one in all of history. It's like, no, this is utterly normal. This is utterly normal and expected for young women to experience. And it was also normal to expect to move past it and expect to enter a heterosexual marriage. But not everybody did. So that's why it makes a great example of a good depiction of the attitudes towards erotic activity at the time and towards, emotional bonds between women that went beyond, simple friendship.
So, given that it's pretty realistic in showing that it is just normal and whatever, I seem to remember you talking about this on Facebook or in your review or something like that, but for people who wouldn't have seen that conversation or wouldn't have read your review, how was the sex actually handled? Was it on the page? Was it off the page? I just remember you saying it was very appropriate, but I'm trying to remember what that meant exactly.
So in Spring Flowering, the sex is on the page. It's not omnipresent. The book is not, an erotic romance, but there is body parts and activities and whatnot explicitly on the page. I'm not very into, strongly erotic romances myself. It's not my thing. Mm-hmm. And it was at a level that I really enjoyed and appreciated. So, taking that as a baseline, when I'm reading a story, so for example, there are a couple of Regency set, very short, novella, more like a novelette that I've read that were basically, this is going to be pornography with costumes. Yeah. That the setup was basically in order to, get two women together in bed and then have long and loving detailed descriptions of, well, okay, I will say that, the notion that you can feel somebody's nipples go sproying through a corset is kind of not really plausible, but but I would not have included books of that type in this list because they aren't Regency romances in the genre sense. I'm looking for something that is primarily about the romance with enough other plot to keep things interesting, but is not primarily about, I'm going to read detailed descriptions of people having sex. And Farah was very emphatic that, by golly, she was going to give her heroines, sex on the page because that's what she wanted to do. But, it is not anything I would call an erotic novel. It is simply a romance novel that does, in fact, have on-page sex.
I think I read one of those, and I would definitely classify that as a plot. What plot kind of a story?
Yeah, I don't want to mention titles or authors.
Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. I think I know exactly what you're talking about, though. So what is your next argument?
So let's see. I think I'm up to number 4 here. And this one is gender-segregated socializing. And this gets back to, some of the just everyday facts of life that are vastly different for people in history at different times. During the early 19th century, actually during the entire 19th century, in England and in many other Western countries, your primary socializing was with people of your same gender. There were not casual opportunities for the mixing of the sexes. You would go to, parties and balls and dinners. These were very formal affairs with very clear rules about how you interacted with people and who you were allowed to talk to and, under what circumstances you could dance with a man. And I don't want to make, too big a deal of it, but the idea is Regency romances in which a man and a woman who are not formally introduced to each other casually meet and strike up, an acquaintance and then a romance are really implausible. Society did not work that way. But between women, that was who you were hanging out with. That was who you worked side by side with in the household. That was who you went visiting in your everyday social activities. That was who you joined clubs with and worked on committees with. You would be interacting with women casually and socially, and once you get outside the household, very often interacting with women across boundaries of class and race and even respectability. Although, obviously people were always very aware of boundaries of things like class and respectability. But there was just massive opportunity for women to meet and interact with other women without the same really strict formal structures. And more to the point, if you looked at all of the possible people that you might have encountered and might have felt some attraction to, 99% of them are going to be of the same sex. So it's a context where the casual opportunities to meet people that you feel something for are going to be enormous between women, as contrasted to the opportunities for, casually getting to know somebody of the opposite sex. And there were very few practical barriers to initiating a close friendship with another woman. And once you had that close friendship, then it could move on to more, if that was where you were inclined. So the idea is that women mostly lived in a female world. And within that female world, you would naturally form your emotional relationships with other women. That, your emotional relationships, your friendships, your casual acquaintances, they would all be women. And it creates a smokescreen, a blind in which moving on to a closer relationship doesn't stand out. The idea that you would become close, intimate friends with this woman that you met at, while visiting at somebody else's house, it's ordinary, it's normal, it's not suspicious. And the book I picked to illustrate this one is The Sisterhood by Penelope Friday. This is put out by Bella Books. And it's her second Regency romance. The first one, which was Petticoats and Promises, that I didn't like it as much because there was no plot other than the romantic relationship. But The Sisterhood really blossoms with regard to subplots and parallel plots and things. The basic blurb here is that Charity Bellingham has been an awkward tomboy all her life, burdened with the knowledge that she wasn't the son her father wanted and doomed to be a wallflower. Her older sister accepts an advantageous, if far from brilliant, marriage to a wealthy social climber, and when their mother washes her hands of both her daughters and decamps off to Bath, Charity is left as a dependent on her brother-in-law with no good prospects of escape. But her life changes when she falls in with a circle of female friends that cuts across the barriers of class, wealth, and education, and who devote themselves to artistic and charitable works, including anti-slavery activism. The Sisterhood, as they call themselves, also share an interest in same-sex love. So the reason that this is a great example of the what historians call a homosocial context is that Charity's options for meeting people, for making friends, are going to be entirely within a female-centered, network. And her connections with specific women brought her into this larger social circle where she then, had the opportunity to meet more women, to meet women who were, emotionally congenial. And in this case, provided a context where these women were also active in romantic relationships with each other and could sort of, give a helping hand to, understanding how to set up a relationship, how to work your way through, the breakups and the ups and downs. And it also very nicely illustrates the ways in which women's social activism at this time overlapped really strongly with communities of women-centered women. And I use women-centered women very much in the 70s and 80s sense, not necessarily of women with romantic relationships with each other, but women whose primary social and intellectual interactions were with and for other women. And during the 18th and 19th century, especially among intellectual women, there is a very strong overlap between romantic relationships and activism. And this book captures that perfectly, that historic sense of the ways in which these two movements intersected and overlapped.
Very cool. Is it actually a romance?
Yes, it is. There is a romance. There is a happily ever after. All of the books I picked here are romance in shape, in plot shape. But not all of them get there by a straight line, as it were.
Okay, so what's your last argument?
So the last one is the wealth of historic role models we have around 1800 for women who are known to have had, historic women who are known to have had romantic, sexual, or marital relationships with each other. And I will get to what I mean by women in marital relationships with each other. So the turn of the 19th century sits within this just enormous wealth of real-world role models that can inform and shape the stories that authors want to tell. One celebrity couple who were lionized by supporters of romantic friendship and were held up as an ideal, a social ideal, were Lady Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, who were known as the Ladies of Llangollen, named after the Welsh village where they settled together. They were daughters of respectable Anglo-Irish families who fell in love and decided to elope in order to spend their lives together. And despite some initial difficulties, they succeeded. They bought a cottage in the village of Llangollen and became famous for the devotion to each other. They became, this model of what romantic friendship was about, the dream of, living in secluded romantic isolation and spending all of your time together. And people went on pilgrimages to go visit them because they were so famous as living out this ideal. Famous poets wrote odes to them. William Wordsworth wrote poetry about them. And they projected an image that was non-sexual. They were, in this sense, they were very much the icon of romantic friendship in the non-sexual sense. But that doesn't mean that their relationship was definitely physical. We can see that from their diaries. And it gets back to that whole question of how do you define sex. But they were also somewhat self-conscious of people perceiving their relationship as being, perhaps a little beyond the pale in terms of, sexual and gender roles. There was an occasion when there was a newspaper article that kind of hinted that they had a butch femme thing going on. It described Eleanor Butler as being, tall and mannish and always wearing riding habits, which riding habits were very coded in terms of clothing. To accuse a woman of being an Amazon and wearing riding habits all the time was as much as to say that one suspected that, her feelings were, for the fairer sex. And so there was this newspaper article that wrote about them and used this coded language to suggest that there was a butch femme thing going on. And Eleanor Butler consulted a lawyer about suing the newspaper reporter for slander because she felt that this was going to ruin her reputation. Now, the fact of the matter is that, there was something there to be ruined, that there was... If people had in fact known all the details of their life, that they might not have had enjoyed quite such a reputation. There was another contemporary of theirs named Hester Thrale, who was a gossip columnist, not in the literal sense, but she gossiped about the people in her social circle. And although she obviously would not have used that term for it, she was very, very proud of her gaydar. She could spot a sodomite from 50 paces. And although as I said earlier, the attitudes towards male and female homosexuality were very different in high society. There is also one passage in one of her diaries where she's talking about the ladies of Llangollen and refers to them as damned saphists. Although in most of her other public writings, she is one of the people praising them and saying how wonderful they are, in this romantic friendship relationship. So, here's an example where there are hints around the edges that people thought maybe their relationship was something more than just very, very good friends. And yet they still managed to keep that image of being this highly praised, highly valued image of female friendship. Now, another one of their contemporaries who, in fact, traveled to Llangollen she was able to meet Eleanor Butler. Sarah was not feeling well at the time, so she didn't meet her. And this traveler was Anne Lister, who you may recognize the name of. Anne Lister was a well-off landowner from Yorkshire who left extensive diaries written in code that detail her sexual relationships with other women in her social circle in great detail. And the fact that the diaries have come down to us and been deciphered and published is a treasure of understanding the variety of ways in which women might understand themselves at that time. We are positive that Anne Lister had this image of herself as being something it is not inaccurate to call a lesbian, although she did not use that word. She writes in her diary, and I quote, "I love and only love the fairer sex, and thus, beloved by them in turn, my heart revolts from any other love than theirs." She explicitly rejected the idea of marrying a man, and she had a bit of a more marginally scandalous life. There were people who thought that some of her friendships were a little bit maybe questionable, but she had the advantage of being a landowner. She had the advantage of being wealthy enough to be able to ignore some of the gossip. And she had something pretty close to a, happily ever after, although her life was cut short a bit by illness. She and her girlfriend, who was a neighboring landowner, who they had moved in together and set up a joint coal mine operation, I believe. They were making a world tour. They were traveling in, I'm trying to remember now, the Caucasus Mountains. Anyway, traveling somewhere in Eastern Europe, and fell sick and died. But other than that, I would definitely say that her life counts as a happily ever after for a lesbian proto-marriage, as it were. Oh, and getting back to, so she went to visit Eleanor Butler and wrote in her diaries afterwards that although everybody says that it was a platonic friendship, she believed it was, quote, cemented by something more tender still than friendship, unquote. So here was a woman who was herself, sexually involved with women, who looked at their relationship and said, yeah, she's one of us. She's one of us, yes. And besides these, sort of celebrities, although you can't really call Anne Lister a celebrity in her own time in the same way that Ponsonby and Butler were, but she's certainly, a celebrity in the context of historical research today. But the later to 18th century gives us a lot, and by a lot, I mean like dozens, of examples of women, and I'm going to be very, very careful about how I word this now, people who had grown up as women, who enjoyed partnerships and even marriage with women by virtue of taking on the social role of a man. And because the records we have are largely, from the outside, from newspaper accounts and whatnot, that often just say the bare fact of, a female husband was discovered married to, so-and-so in such and such a place. And we can't really know on an individual basis how they understood their own gender and sexuality. It is almost certain that some of these people would today consider themselves to be trans men. It is also certain that some of them had, entered into this strategy understanding themselves as women, but as a way to have a lifelong relationship with a woman. These are working class people. You didn't find this kind of strategy among the upper middle class and the upper classes, because it relied entirely on being able to leave your old life behind, to leave behind anybody who knew you previously, to reinvent yourself as someone presenting as a man, and then, marrying a woman that, not all passing women, as they call them, married. But when they did marry, there was an official name for it. These were female husbands. And it was, everybody knew what you meant when you said that, which gives an indication of how common the phenomenon was. In some cases, these couples would live together until one of them died, and then that was when the secret came out. In some cases, there would be some other reason. There was one famous case where blackmail was involved in the disguise being uncovered. But it was an option. It was not an easy option, and it did mean, as I say, cutting yourself off from people who had known you previously. But it's a thing. It is a thing. And now the female husband, phenomenon, shall we say, did start trailing off a bit after 1800. You get fewer and fewer mentions of examples. And it may be that to some extent this was because marriage laws got stricter about, proving who you were and, that you had people who could vouch for you. It may also simply be that the news cycle had moved on and it wasn't the hot new topic anymore. These things happen. So, within the, moving on into the later Regency era, and certainly in the Victorian era, you have fewer examples of this being taken as a casual thing. You still have examples of passing women and sometimes passing women marrying other women, but it becomes less of a, shall we say, an ordinary thing. And now we get to the book that we talked about at the beginning of the show. This is The Covert Captain, or A Marriage of Equals, by Jeannelle M. Ferreira, and it is self-published. And it definitely takes this motif of moving through the world, presenting as a man, and using that in order to enjoy a romance with a woman. It takes this, all the way through. So the basic story is Nathaniel Fleming, a veteran of Waterloo, falls in love with his major's spinster sister, Harriet. But Nathaniel has a secret. She's actually Eleanor Fleming, who took her dead brother's commission and joined the army to escape an impossible situation at home. So her secret has been shared with only a very few select and discreet women up till now, but the quiet affection that she shares with Harriet grows to a point when only marriage will answer. But will Harriet accept Eleanor in the same way that she has Nathaniel? And more to the point, will Harriet's brother accept her? So this is a wonderfully complex novel. It has a lot of different themes. It touches very heavily on what we would call PTSD from the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, and, what soldiers went through after coming back and trying to put lives together again. It touches on the surplus women issue, because Harriet she's in her, I think, late 20s, and, she has no prospects of marriage and, quite frankly, at this point, no interest in marrying. It touches on several of the other themes. There's an element of the same-sex socializing involving Harriet's time at a boarding school, which, becomes relevant later on. But the big point here is that Eleanor is living as Nathaniel and therefore socializing in the world as a man. And one of the things this means is that when she and Harriet start getting to know each other and start becoming attracted to each other, they are under those constraints of the ways in which, men and women were constrained in socializing, and the expectations that were placed on them if that friendship began to develop. So one of the things that happens is, that Nathaniel and Harriet are clearly and obviously attracted to each other and are enjoying each other's company. And the entire world around them says, well, okay, when's the wedding going to be? And at that point, Nathaniel is thinking, okay, can I carry this off? Mm-hmm. And, well, let's just say that that happens around the middle of the book. So there's a lot more that happens after that. And the book very nicely captures both the possibility of this kind of... I always hate using the word disguise or masquerade because it's very tricky to talk about lesbian representation in gender disguise plots without accidentally really stepping on the toes of people who want to read transgender plots. Mm-hmm. And when you're looking at historical examples, you really have to have an unresolved conclusion. You really have to look at them and say, either interpretation it needs to be equally plausible, or you are in fact erasing some of the possibilities. I take a different attitude towards novels because there we are getting inside the personalities of the characters. We are getting inside them and understanding that even though the world might not be certain whether this person is, a woman in disguise or a trans man, the character knows. The character knows. And so this is an example where, I differ with some of my close friends on appropriate ways to present this in fiction. But what the novel does is show that this was a thing. This happened. And whatever the motivations of the person involved, it was possible, far more possible than some people might believe. And people made their lives in this way against the expectations that they had grown up with. Military contexts were always a place where you could reinvent yourself, in part because they were kind of desperate for recruits and they didn't, question too heavily who the person was, in many senses. And the military was a way to get away from your home context where people who knew you and might recognize you were. And so the prevalence of this kind of cross-gender disguise in historical fiction is not actually historically implausible, although, that doesn't mean it's always done well. In this case, I think it is done well. And I really, really enjoyed this story. And the basic shape of Nathaniel Fleming's life story here is solidly rooted in the historic era and exemplifies one context in which you could have two women, and I will call them women because that's how the character identifies, who could eventually marry and live as a married couple, happily ever after for the rest of their lives.
So before we started recording this, I told you that I snuck a peek at your review. By the time this goes up, it will be up at the Lesbian Review. I would urge anybody listening to this to go read that review because it made me go out and immediately buy this book. I haven't started it yet, but I am so excited to read it. This just sounds like 5 fabulous books that I can't wait to get my hands on. Thank you so much, Heather. So where can people find you online if they want to connect with you?
The best place to find me online is at my website, which is alpenia.com, ALPENNIA.com, which is where the Lesbian Historic Motif Project blog lives. And it also has, a page about the podcast. And it has, lots of posts about my own fiction and things like that. I'm also on Twitter a lot at Heather Rose Jones. But you have to be tricky because I have too many letters in my name. So I only have one R between Heather and Rose. So it's like Heather Ose Jones. And I'm also on Facebook. I have an author page on Facebook. And if you like my stuff and you ask to friend me and you tell me who you are, I will add you to my friends list as well. But that's not public. And obviously the Lesbian Talk Show Facebook group, I hang out there a lot. And that's pretty much it.
That's a lot, though. There's a lot of ways to find Heather, and you should, because she has a wealth of knowledge of lesbians in history, and it's fascinating. And I would just urge you to poke through and check it all out. So that is all for this episode. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk about this topic.
So, I'm Tara. You've been listening to Les Do Books. Remember to email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with your questions or comments, or if you're an author who's interested in joining me on the show to talk about the lesfic you love or trends that have you interested, please let me know. If you've enjoyed this episode, please check out the show notes where you'll find a Patreon link for the Lesbian Talk Show. Just a little bit would go a long way to cover hosting costs for shows like this, and you'll get exclusive content if you are a Patreon. Also, don't forget to join us at our Facebook group, the Lesbian Review Book Club, so you can talk about anything that you're reading and loving. You can find me and all the other podcasters like Heather on the Lesbian Talk Show channel at our Facebook group that she mentioned, the Lesbian Talk Show chat group. To find this and many other great shows, all you need to do is search for the Lesbian Talk Show on iTunes, Podbean, or Stitcher.